There's a town somewhere in America where everybody hurts. Nobody can say exactly why. The doctor works hard and gets nowhere. And then a carousel arrives. Six fiberglass horses on a blazing neon fairground ride, and a showman in a white double-breasted suit who says that one ride will take the pain away. And it does. The first ride is free. After that, he calls it dynamic pricing. I'm Val. This is Opera in Context from Opera Guide. On Saturday, the 12th of September, Missy Mazzoli's The Galloping Cure has its Nordic premiere at Norrlandsoperan in Umeå in the north of Sweden. There are only 5 performances there, and I'm going to be at the first one. Before I go, I want to set out what I'll be watching for, because I think it's worth deciding what the questions are, while the answers still don't exist. Let me tell you what this is. The Galloping Cure is a new opera by the American composer Missy Mazzoli with a libretto by Royce Vavrek based on a story by the novelist Karen Russell, which takes its bones from a Franz Kafka story called A Country Doctor. It had its world premiere at the Edinburgh International Festival on the 9th of August. Tom Morris directs, and he's also credited with the dramaturgy. In Umeå, Leah Hausman joins him as associate director and movement director. Rebecca Rinks designed the set, Christina Cunningham the costumes, Lucy Carter the lighting, and Will Duke the projections. Jessica Cottis conducts Norrlandsoperan's symphony orchestra, the Edinburgh Principals travel. Daniela Mack sings Dr. Teresa Hart, Justin Austin sings Lucky Mack, and Susan Bullock sings Ivona Kowalski. But the rest of the town is Swedish. The Swedish-Norwegian soprano Sandra Bendrick sings Noi, Teresa's daughter, and there's a large Swedish ensemble around her. So 3 American and British principals will be standing inside a Swedish town. It runs 2 hours and 25 minutes, including a 30-minute interval, and it's sung in English with Swedish and English surtitles. So we already know what Edinburgh thought. The notices were strong and they weren't unanimous, and both of those things matter. Going by the tallies the Opera House is quoting on its own website, the Times and the Telegraph both gave it 5 stars, and the Guardian, the Financial Times, and the Scotsman gave it 4. The Times called it one of the greatest operas of the century. Nicholas Kenyon in the Telegraph called it a defining opera of our time. But the Scotsman's David Kettle, who admired it, still found the closing act less persuasive. The British Theatre Guide thought the clashing musical styles never quite felt intuitive, and that most of the characters never quite felt grounded in themselves. There were questions about the allegory, questions about the surrealism, and a question underneath all of it about whether the sheer theatrical spectacle ever overwhelms the human story it's carrying. So when we sit down in Umeå, what should we actually be watching for? Let's start with the carousel. The central metaphor is simple. A community is suffering. Lucky Mack arrives with a magic carousel. The ride takes the pain away. The first ride is free, and then the price begins to rise. Eventually, getting off becomes almost impossible. We understand the metaphor. The carousel is addiction. The ride is relief. The rising price is dependence and then exploitation. But that isn't the question I want to take into the theater. The question is whether I actually want to ride it, because if the carousel looks dangerous from the beginning, the metaphor is easy. But if it looks beautiful, if it looks exciting, if it looks like exactly the thing you'd reach for when you were hurting, then the story becomes much more uncomfortable. So I'll be watching for the moment when pleasure becomes danger. I'll be listening for the moment when the music changes, and I'll be asking myself at what point I would have stopped writing. The second thing is the score, because that's what nearly everybody agreed on. Mazzoli's music moves between orchestral writing, electronic sound, carnival music, and club rhythms. There's a battery of percussion in it, and pre-recorded club beats built by 2 collaborators, Bloom and Lorna Doone. And that matters more than it sounds. Because this isn't only a story about something dangerous, it's a story about something seductive. So don't listen only for what sounds beautiful. Listen for what sounds pleasurable. What does relief sound like? And what does craving sound like? What does the music do when the thing that once meant pleasure turns into something compulsive? And listen carefully to Lucky Mack. Does he sound like a villain, or does he sound like somebody offering exactly what everyone desperately wants? Because if he sounds seductive, the opera's moral universe gets a great deal more complicated. Which brings me to Lucky Mack himself. It would be easy to make him the villain. The charismatic salesman, the man who arrives in a desperate community and turns suffering into profit. But the opera seems to resist making it quite that simple, so I'll be watching him closely. Does he know that what he's selling is destructive? Does he believe in his own cure? Is he exploiting desperation? Or is he answering something people already wanted badly? And here's the uncomfortable version of that question. Would Lucky Mack have any power at all if nobody wanted what he was selling? That moves the opera past the story of one bad man towards something more disturbing, a system almost everybody takes part in. If the spectacle belongs to Lucky Mack, the emotional center may belong to Dr. Teresa Hart. She's the doctor in a deindustrialized town where everyone is in pain and nothing she does is enough. The Opera House describes her as suspecting that something is wrong and not wanting to refuse her patients help. That's the whole trap in one sentence. She isn't standing outside the crisis looking in, she's inside it. And she has a daughter, Noi, which means that whatever the carousel does to this town, it will reach her own family. So I'll be watching when Teresa begins to doubt, watching what she knows, watching what she refuses to know, and watching how long she keeps going once the doubt has arrived. Because the opera may be asking something much harder than whether Lucky Mack is responsible. It may be asking what responsibility belongs to a good person working inside a destructive system. The fifth thing is the criticism I most want to test for myself. Writing in The Guardian, Clive Paget found the contemporary parallels a little obvious, though he thought the opera still reflected the insidious way prescription painkillers reach ordinary people, elderly people, and most tragically children. And that's something any of us can test in the room, because the symbolism isn't hard to decode. Carousel, opioids, ride intoxication, rising price, dependence, we get it. But perhaps that's the point. Maybe the production isn't asking us to solve a puzzle. Maybe it's asking us to sit inside the metaphor until it becomes unbearable. So watch for the moment when you feel the opera has explained itself once too often, and then ask whether that weakens the story, or whether the repetition is what makes the experience disturbing. And then there are the sheep. Yes, the sheep. There are dogs too, two farm dogs called Meg and Sam, and their proper singing roles taken by Katrina Hewitson and Edward Jowl. There's black comedy, and there are moments that come straight out of a nightmare. This is where the Edinburgh critics divided most sharply. David Kettle in The Scotsman found the woofing dogs and bleating sheep a jarring note of whimsy that distracted from the intensity elsewhere. I want to give that its full weight before I go in, because it's the most specific objection anybody made. But here's the other case. Ask what the animals can say that the humans can't. Are they witnesses? A chorus? A conscience? Or are they telling us we've entered a world where the ordinary rules have stopped applying, which is exactly what the inside of a crisis feels like? And notice when you laugh, because the humor matters. If a production can make you laugh and then make you uncomfortable moments later, that instability might be its sharpest weapon. The seventh thing is what the ride actually costs. The horses here aren't puppets. They're fiberglass on a fairground carousel, lit up on a set of steel walkways. That's a deliberately cheap-looking miracle, and I think that's the point. What I'll be watching is what the price turns into, because the reviews out of Edinburgh describe a progression, money first. Then, when the money runs out, payments the reviewers called disfiguring. The Scotsman singled out Susan Bullock for finding the pitch black comedy in what it called the opera's grisliest scene. I don't know what that scene is, I'll find out on the 12th. But if the arc is what it sounds like, then the opera is building towards something worse than a metaphor about drugs. A system assembling itself out of the people it consumes. The eighth thing is to look past the opioid crisis. It's tempting to describe The Galloping Cure simply as an opera about opioids. It is one, but I don't think that's enough. The story reaches into something larger: physical pain, psychological pain, grief, loneliness, economic desperation, the fear of watching somebody you love suffer, and the wish for somebody, anybody, to arrive and say that they can make it stop. That's the real danger. Because if Lucky Mack disappeared tomorrow, would the pain go with him? Probably not. And that may be the darkest idea in the piece. The ninth thing is the one I find most interesting, and it's about how this opera got to Umeå. This isn't a touring show that happened to find a Swedish booking. Norrlandsoperan is one of only three houses that commissioned it, with Opera Ventures Productions and Scottish Opera, and they call it their largest international co-production so far. But there's something else. The Swedish part of the production was funded by Riksbankens Jubileumsfond, and that funding paid for something beyond the staging. It paid for a collaboration with Swedish academic research into the ethical gray zones of the pharmaceutical industry. Two professors fed into the artistic process: Mats G. Hansson at Uppsala University and Susanne Lundin at Lund University. And there's a public lecture running alongside the premiere on dilemmas and tragedies in the gray zones of healthcare. I think that's the difference worth watching for, because this year's Edinburgh International Festival was themed around the United States, marking America's 250th birthday. Edinburgh presented this piece as American. Umeå isn't doing that. Umeå has attached it to a research question about medicine and ethics that isn't specific to America at all. Same opera, different frame, and the questions underneath it were never only American. What happens when medicine becomes a market? What happens when relief becomes need? What happens when a society wants an easy answer badly enough that somebody will always turn up to sell one? Sweden has its own version of that conversation, and it isn't the same as America's. So I'll be watching the audience as well as the stage, where people laugh, where they go quiet, which images cross the distance and which ones don't. And finally, the question I think matters more than any of the others: does the human story survive the spectacle? Because The Galloping Cure gives you an enormous amount to look at: the carousel, the neon, the animals, the lighting, the projections, the club beats, the black comedy. It's a lot, and spectacular theater is a wonderful thing, but opera has to make us care about people. So when the curtain falls, the first question isn't whether it was impressive. The first question is who I'm thinking about: Teresa, Lucky Mack, Ivona, Noy, or only the carousel. If I'm thinking about a person, the opera has done something greater than spectacle. If I'm thinking only about the carousel, then the critics who found the allegory too obvious may have been right. The metaphor will have swallowed the people. So those are the 5 questions I'm taking into the Nordic premiere. 1. When did I first want to ride the carousel, and when did that feeling change? 2. Who bears the greatest responsibility for what happens? 3. Did the surrealism deepen the story or distract from it? 4. Which human relationships survived the spectacle? And 5. When it ended, was I thinking about opioid addiction or about something larger? Because the most interesting question about The Galloping Cure isn't whether it can repeat what it found in Edinburgh. It's whether a second audience in a different country, in a different frame, watching the same strange carousel, sees something the first audience didn't. On September the 12th, the carousel starts turning again, this time in Umeå, and I'll tell you what happened on the 13th. Opera is global, alive, and always worth listening to closely.